House.
The question is that the motion be agreed to. The Honourable Phil Goff.
Mr Speaker, Labor supports this bill, but I've got to say that that ministerial explanation and read speech was pretty unconvincing as a justification for what we're doing in the House tonight. What disappointed me about the Minister's speech as well, Mr Speaker, is that he persisted in his refusal during the Committee of the Whole to give an explanation as to why this bill, whose short title says the Trade Safeguards Measures Act 2008, is coming back to the House in 2014. That's over 5 years. Now, just to pick up Paul Hutchison's interjection there, Labor introduced this bill at the end of 2008. So Labor got the bill into the House, and this national government by itself, by its incompetence, by its mismanagement, has spent over 5 years on a bill that is not controversial and now finally, tardily, is going through its third reading in the House tonight. So I want to know from Mr Hutchison or Mr Hayes or whoever will be the next national speaker, what is the explanation for that huge delay in the passage of this legislation? Is it indeed incompetence? Is it indeed poor management? Is it because John Banks was in charge of the bill for a while and the last thing the national government wanted was John Banks exposed in the chair as the minister in charge of the bill? Or is it, and perhaps this is a likely explanation, simply because National in its heart doesn't believe this bill is actually necessary? Now, whichever one of those explanations is the most compelling, I think the National Party owes it to the House to give that explanation because the Minister failed to do so in the Committee of the Whole. You know, we are reporting back in the third reading on the Committee of the Whole. That's what the third reading is about, Mr Speaker. But I've got to report to you that the only reason that we knew the Minister in the chair was actually alive was occasionally he blinked. Occasionally he blinked. But he didn't get up and answer questions. What is the point of paying a minister a salary and putting him in the chair if he's not going to actually do what he's paid to do and to give an explanation to the House to genuine, rational questions that are raised in the Committee of the Whole? Now, I want to come back to the point about whether the government actually believes this bill is necessary. We are, of course, Mr Speaker, a free trade country, and we're proud of that. Way back in the 1980s, we removed the high levels of protectionism that actually damaged the economic future of this country. By the way, it also made it more difficult for trade ministers because it took away our negotiating coin when we were trying to negotiate agreements for free trade with other countries. But the question is whether we need these particular safeguard mechanisms. Now, free trade doesn't mean to say that you don't have to have measures to ensure that trade is fair, Mr Speaker. And there are clearly some safeguard mechanisms that are patently necessary for any country. And most of those in our country are contained in the Dumping and Countervailing Duties Act 1988. That provides genuine safeguard measures that stop another country from dumping goods in this country at a price lower than it costs to produce them. That's not a level playing field. That's not fair competition. And of course you need anti-dumping measures to stop other countries doing it. You also need countervailing duties. Countervailing duties are what we put on when the government in the country where the exports are coming from are subsidising those exports, which again makes the trade unfair and not on a level playing field. But this bill does something different. It sets out safeguard measures and provisional safeguard duties which apply. I don't read my speeches, Mr Henare, and you probably can't read your speeches, but anyway, it's nice that you're in the House tonight and it's nice that you're still with us, albeit for another couple of months. and you'll be going with quite a number of your colleagues, some of which are going voluntarily and many of which will be going because the country's had enough of them. But I don't want to be distracted by Mr Henare. That's probably been the major achievement of Mr Henare over his years in this House, is to provide a distraction. And sometimes it's humorous and we welcome that. But the fact of the matter is, these safeguard measures are designed to provide protection when there is a surge of imports coming in, and designed to facilitate adjustment by the domestic industries affected. But what we heard from the Minister at last in his third reading speech was that how many times have these measures been used since 1987? They've actually been put up 4 times, and countervailing duties have been applied once. Once in how many years? We're talking about 25 years, 30 years? So the question is, how important are these measures? What are the industries that might be protected by the employment of these measures? Now, I'm going to ask Mr Hayes that, because he should take the next call as the chairman of the committee. What are the industries that are likely to be protected by this, given that our average tariff rates are probably around 2%? And I've got to say, Mr Speaker, I do have some doubts as to whether these are actually going to be employed, and that is probably the reason that the government has dawdled over this bill for the 6 years that it has taken. I've also got to express my concern because I know too often that special safeguard mechanisms can be abused. And Mr Hayes and Mr Hutchison know from our recent trip to China that actually the special agricultural safeguard mechanisms that are being employed against our exports are not actually justified by the rationale that we are causing damage to the Chinese dairy industry. Now, I didn't want the special safeguard mechanisms in the Free Trade Act, Mr Speaker. I actually opposed those, but the fact of the matter was that the Ministry of Agriculture in China wanted to maintain dairy tariffs, and they were absolutely miffed when I negotiated with the Chinese Premier Wen Jiabao to remove the tariffs over a period of time completely. And the consolation to the Chinese Ministry of Agriculture was a special safeguard mechanism that we thought would never be used, because we set them well above the level of the prevailing trade. Actually, because of the massive increase in trade following the free trade agreement, those special safeguard mechanisms now come into effect quite early in the trading year, and they cost us tens of millions of dollars, and we're not happy about that. We don't complain too much about it because of the very good return we're getting on the sale of our dairy products. But I raise this example, Mr Speaker, as an example of how a safeguard mechanism can be misused, not for the legitimate purpose of protecting an industry against damage, but in the case of China, our exports have increased, not causing damage to the Chinese industry, but because the demand has risen hugely. So the question is, why this bill? Well, if the Minister won't answer, and I suspect the National Party won't answer, I suppose we have to answer our own questions. And the fact is that this bill does do some useful things. It streamlines the process of responding to allegations of dumped and subsidised goods. It removes the requirements of the temporary safeguard authorities, and I think that the Ministry of Business, Innovation and Employment can quite readily do that in a more cost-effective way. We don't need the special safeguard authorities, and it does set a more realistic timeframe for the hearing of the completion of a safeguard investigation. 30 days isn't enough time to do it properly. 75 days is certainly more realistic. And I think the bill, as drafted by Leanne Dalzell, does set out very clearly the actions that the Minister can take and the process that the Minister must follow. And it is important because that helps ensure that the safeguard mechanism is not misused. It sets out that you have to prove injury, that the injury was unforeseen, that this measure is necessary to prevent or to remedy the injury. The safeguard has to be of an appropriate extent and duration. It must be in the public interest, and that's probably the most important safeguard against the misuse of safeguards that there is in the bill, Mr Speaker, and it must be compatible with New Zealand's international trade negotiations. We made some useful amendments in the Select Committee to that process. We will be supporting the bill, but I've got to again express my regret, Mr Speaker, that the Minister utterly failed to justify the bill that is in his name.
Mr Speaker.
I call John Hayes.
Mr Speaker, I've got to say that that was an absolutely, well, the first part of that speech was